Welcome to the Property Buyer Podcast, where we explore the world of residential and commercial real estate to help you make better decisions about buying, selling, or investing in all types of property. Join me, Rich Harvey, CEO of propertybuyer.com.au and multi-award-winning buyer's advocate. Our podcast features expert interviews, market trends and insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of Australian real estate. Whether you're a home buyer, a seasoned property investor, commercial buyer, developer, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge, strategies, and experience and help you achieve your property goals. Well, welcome to our next edition of the Property Buyer Podcast. We often hear about people who've been successful in building up a substantial property portfolio, and we often dream about being in that position ourselves. We think to ourselves, how did they get there and what tactics did they use? Is it really achievable to get a portfolio given that property prices are getting higher every day and the banks are still really tight with lending standards? We dream about how it would be to take the pressure off having to work every day, having less stress and a life without money worries. We might think about the satisfaction of having assets that grow while you sleep and being in a position to help your kids and be generous with others or be philanthropic with your money. Well, today you're in for a treat. I'm about to interview a highly successful property investor who's built a substantial portfolio and freely shares his knowledge and experience. Jeremy Iannuzzelli is a founding partner of KHI Accounting Group. Now, using a combination of investment strategies and tax-effective structures, Jeremy has a passion for helping investors acquire and hold more wealth and helping them well into retirement. Jeremy, great to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rich. Absolute pleasure as always, mate.
Now, Jeremy, we have a little strange tradition and we like to ask our guests a thought of the week. And this week it's from Johann Wolfgang van Goethe, who says, "Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power and magic in it." What do you take from that quote?
It's a great quote that talks about not just dreaming, but turning your dreams into a reality. So taking action. We've got a motto, and one of the partners in our office and the best friend of mine, Manzurul, always talks about dreaming it, believe it, and then acting it. It's all well and good to have the great plan in your mind, but you've got to find a way to execute it. And it even starts with just a little thing, like how to eat an elephant, Rich? And the answer is always one bite at a time. One bite at a time.
Yeah, execute it. I love it. I think you sound like an action-orientated man. It sounds like that's a bit of a culture in your business, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We always live by the motto that to achieve greatness, you need to stop seeking permission and take an action.
Yeah.
So for all of our colleagues, we always say, be bold. Be bold and be daring, and don't be afraid to ask that question, because without it, you or other people won't be able to learn. You won't be able to take a step forward.
Brilliant. No, that's fantastic. Well, Jeremy, can I take you back to where it all started? How did you actually get started with property investment? And I guess what was your key motivations to get going in property?
So I was very fortunate to obviously start in accounting as a professional career at an early age. So, the age of 18, 19. And I was lucky enough to deal with a lot of high net wealth individuals at the time, people who were investing in property. When interest rates were much different when they were today. Rich, back then 8-9% was a normal interest rate in the mid 2000s.
Yeah.
But seeing these people really starting to create wealth and managing their money and buying property, and at that stage property was at relatively good prices, although back then you always say that it was out of reach. So for me, seeing these people actually do it was enough motivation for me to start learning about it. And then having lots of chats. I was a bit of a seminar junkie at that stage. Being a young kid, I was going to 2 seminars every week, one during the week days and one on the weekend, and I was just learning and absorbing as much as I could, more so from people's stories. I've always been a big fan of war stories. More scars you have, the more element that you get relating to what they've done and how they've gone through it, and the battle scars that they've received at the end of it. And to me, that gave me a lot of life lessons from their journey as opposed to learning myself. So motivation came from seeing people actually doing it rather than just reading about it. And then that sparked the interest, which led into now nearly 17 years of property investment journey.
Fantastic. Well, it's often been said that we learn more from our mistakes or from others' mistakes than we do from our own successes, because I think a lot of successful people, unfortunately, have a great deal of hubris about them and, self-promotion. But I think it's really important to stay humble. And just like your philosophy, I think you're there to help other people achieve their goals. It's wonderful. So, yeah, look, talking of mistakes, tell me about some of the biggest mistakes that you might have made and perhaps what you learnt from them. See, I'm going straight there, mate. I'm
Yeah, no, that's
right.
no, it's good, and I share this all the time with a lot of
Yeah.
people. Look, being a younger man with no grey hair at the time and a little bit of experience, or I thought I had a lot, but really back then, looking back with hindsight, there was no experience.
Mm,
For me, Rich, I built my portfolio, my idea of a great portfolio on the number of properties that I had, as opposed to the quality of the properties that I had. It was always about the quantity.
mm,
And I was buying crap. I was buying cheap property at the time, just for the sake of getting a number. I wanted to
mm,
get to 10, and I wanted to have the quickest way to get to 10 properties was to buy cheap and crap.
mm.
And it wasn't the ugly duckling in a good area. It wasn't a good valued property. It was just anything I could get my hands on that was cheap and I could borrow. So I learned quite quickly that when I was buying these very regional properties, or very subpar townhouses at the time, the number was what I was aiming for, not the quality, and therefore I got bitten quite a bit.
When
Um,
did the penny drop for you that you needed to shift your focus from quantity to quality in your
so
portfolio?
So the repair. So being an accountant, I always like to look at percentages and ratios.
Yeah.
And when you're buying a $120,000 property and a new roof needs to be put on it, which costs the same amount as a new roof on a $500,000 property, all of a sudden my repairs and maintenance, or my potential renovations at the time, was adding up to 20 to 30% of the property's cost price.
Wow. Mm,
Now, again, a new hot water system on a $100,000 property at 2,500, that's 2.5% of the property's price just in a hot water system.
yeah.
New kitchen, new bathroom, new roof. All of a sudden, I've just bought the property again. So for me, that was a penny dropping moment to say, what have I done? I'm buying these really cheap, poor quality properties, significant issues in them. I'm buying them for the number, but adding up all this amount of cost of repairs, rental arrears, because a lot of the areas were struggling in terms of tenants. And I was starting to lose a lot of money just holding these things for the longer term.
Mm,
And even if I was to make money from a capital growth perspective, I worked out that on the trajectory I was, the growth I needed to achieve from these properties on a per annum basis exceeded 10%.
yeah.
And we all aim for that 7 to 10% growth in the property market. And if I'm spending 7 to 10% of the property's value in repairs, I'm not really moving forward.
No.
So that was a bit of a pivot point in my
Mm.
portfolio years on, and I started to really clean up and sell off a lot of those properties and move into better quality properties where there was an X factor attached to it. And that was probably the biggest lesson that I learned was, Jeremy, property investing isn't just about a number of properties; it's also about the quality of
Mm.
properties that you're purchasing as well.
It's interesting. I mean, there's often a lot of debate on forums about, how many properties do you need to retire? And I say that's the wrong question. It's what total value of properties do you need to retire? And even more to the point, what's the total of value of equity and cash flow that you're going to get from your portfolio? Because you could have a $10 million portfolio tomorrow, have $9.5 million worth of debt, and you're not going to retire anytime soon, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it can really. But I'm fascinated by your ratio of repairs. That's a really good point. Just on that mistake question, is there any other mistakes that you commonly see other people make? Not necessarily yourself, but being an accountant, you would see a lot of numbers going through your books. But the classic mistakes that you see other investors make trying to build portfolios.
Yeah, so one of the big things I always see is the position of the property as a forecast. So lots of buyers agents, they do it themselves as well. So generally clients will be buying a property with a 20% deposit or a 10% deposit, and they're expecting the balance to come in from the bank. It could be a 90% loan or an 80% loan. They're not factoring in the cost of that deposit. For most investors out there, Rich, a lot of people are borrowing for the deposit using equity from another property.
Mm,
So when they're doing their cash flow forecast and they're not adding that 20 or 25%, which is costs and deposit, it's actually putting the false narrative in their mind that the property's in a different position.
yeah.
And when it comes to the end of the financial year and I'm going through their actual property portfolio and saying, hey guys, your negative gearing from a cash perspective
Mm,
is X amount. What did you feel it would be? And they're saying much lower. And then we work
mm,
through the deposit and costs, and all of a sudden they're out of pocket an extra 10 or 15 grand, which in most cases is a lot of money for many people to sink.
Mm.
So the big thing is the forecast of numbers, people not knowing their numbers of the existing portfolio. For me, I reconcile my portfolio across all my 23 properties on a monthly basis because I treat my properties like a business.
Mm.
And that business is so important because the ins and outs really drive the next purchases I'm making. People don't generally treat their properties like a business. They wait till the end of the year to see what the outcome is. And I think that's probably a very poor decision because you really need to be active with how your portfolio is being managed and the numbers on a month by month basis. So you know where to tighten the belt or where you can start to push forward with other properties
Mm.
or other types of assets. So I think people not knowing their numbers is where I see the biggest mistake.
Mm.
And then that doesn't give you the plan to move forward.
Excellent points. So just think about someone who's, seen the title of this podcast, How to Build a $7 Million Portfolio from Scratch. What's your advice for someone just starting out or pretty early on in their investment journey where they might not have an investment property yet, or maybe just one or two, but really want to get a substantial portfolio? What's your advice for them and how can they get going?
So understanding the end game of what you're trying to achieve is important and manufacturing the calculation backwards. So for many people, I'll ask the question, what type of level of passive income would you like to say that you've achieved what you've achieved? And then from there, they say, well, I might want $100,000. We gross it up to include expenses. And that means they're going to need about a $2.5 million portfolio, roughly fully paid off to get their 100 grand after expense income.
Yep.
Then what I really do is I say, guys, you need to sit down with a mortgage broker and share that vision with them. Because if your peak borrowing capacity is only 1 million or 1.5, and you need to buy $2.5 million worth of property, how are we going to fill that gap? So the lending strategy is so important. I probably pay more emphasis to the lending strategy early on in your portfolio. So you're getting it right and utilizing your professionals as a journeyman as opposed to a transaction. And I think that's the biggest key because a lot of people start planning when they hit a roadblock. And the plan should be done at the very start and just implementing it. One of the biggest things is don't become too paralyzed by analyzing numbers. I feel there's so many forums out there now and so many different media publications, and my social media rich is filled with so many people's different opinions on how to get to the same outcome. I sometimes feel that you've got to really find your own path,
Mm.
and your own path comes from the knowledge that you gain with the professionals around you, so you can achieve what you're after. And that's
Mm.
done at the start, not done when the roadblock occurs.
Yeah, I love that. I really like that. Understand the end game. Exactly what, one of my mentors who I've never met is Stephen Covey, who said, begin with the end in mind. So if your end goal is literally, 200K worth of passive income, you're going to need to be pretty close to $5 million worth of unencumbered property to deliver that. And you're absolutely right. Getting the right advice around the team, so the right accountant, the right buyer's agent, and particularly the right mortgage broker who's investment savvy is absolutely critical. And then considering what kind of strategy, like you say, there's no one size fits all. And a lot of people get hung up about picking a strategy. At the end of the day, there's multiple strategies that can get you to this point. But some people agonize over them for years. Meanwhile, the market's moved up 10 or 20%. Just pick one, and go with it. Like,
Absolutely.
some people get that analysis paralysis disease and just can't move forward. Look, talking about picking both an investment property and a strategy, what's some investment criteria do you recommend when selecting a property strategy?
So there's different stages in your investment journey, Rich. You've got someone who's quite novice, someone who is a little bit more advanced, and then someone who's willing to take a little bit more risk with the knowledge that they've developed. And now I'm probably in that third stage, that pivot stage of my investment career. For me now, a lot of the properties that I'm choosing are very much X factor. I don't necessarily buy something where I can't manufacture my own level of equity or my own level of rental income. But for people that are starting in the portfolio journey, you need to be looking at your really good cookie cutter properties that are going to have low maintenance, give you that really good taste and flavor into the investment journey. If you're having a property that so many people I know have bought one or two properties and stopped because they've just had a terrible experience, whether it's a off the plan home that's riddled with issues or took 6 to 12 months longer than they initially anticipated. Could be a really old home where they had a DIY disaster. Or it could be a unit, for instance, that was sitting in a very saturated market. So you've just got to pick something that's relatively stable, not going to absolutely win races on one side, but not on the other side, not going to lose you anything either. A really good taste and a flavour into something's really important. You gradually build your palate up to something quite spicy, Rich, as my father says, before you
Love
dip
it.
straight into the
Yeah.
jalapeno or the
Yeah.
Reese's,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
for anyone starting, that's what you really
Yeah.
need to be looking at, something very
Yeah.
stable.
Yeah, I think of another analogy. It's a bit like an athlete, or when you're younger, you've got to learn to walk before you run. I mean, you're at a stage now where you can do quite advanced type of strategies and investments. And a lot of people buying their second property. Okay, well, let's do a development site. We see these developers apparently making a mozza. Let's go and, spend a few $1 million, not knowing all the pitfalls and all the risks. So I think it's really important to even think about commercial property. I always say to my clients, get a couple of resi properties under your belt before you think about getting a commercial, just because of the risk of vacancy. So there's different strategies, but learning the basics, learning the ropes before you really dive into some more sophisticated strategies, I think is important.
Absolutely.
Tell me more about your thinking here. I want to delve into your mind about how you decide where to invest. Is that an important thing to you about your location?
Yeah, absolutely. So location for me is very important. Now, one of the first criteria that I look at when I'm choosing an area is how easy it is to get things through council. So I'll go to my own backyard, if I may. I'm in the Liverpool LGA, and from a Liverpool perspective, the wait times at the moment in council are anywhere between 9 to 18 months.
Mm.
So for me, where my strategy is adding value through building additional dwellings and duplexes and triplexes and other things, for me, it's a long time from the time that I buy the property to the time that I actually get the property out of DA or council. And that to me is cost. There's a
Mm.
significant amount of holding costs and opportunity costs attached to it. So for me, I'm looking for friendly councils that are pro my strategy. And then I start to look at the macro or micro factors. I'm looking at the population. I'm looking at the jobs. I'm also looking at just the areas, gentrification in general. A lot of Sydney, for example, Rich, has gentrified substantially over the last 20 years. And what was a bad area is now is $1 million area. And that natural gentrification is occurring everywhere. We look at Queensland, especially in the Logan area, where it was considered a quite a
Mm.
low socio-demographic area, and now you
Mm.
can't pick up anything less than 500,000 there.
Yep.
So the areas are changing. Areas will gentrify as everyone's income start to increase. So that's another micro and macro factor that I'm looking at in a particular area. And then I'm looking at the last thing. I'm looking at, well, who's going to be utilizing or buying the property that I'm going to be creating. So for me, what type of market am I aiming for? Am I aiming for the Airbnb holiday stay market? Am I aiming for the long-term rentals? I'm trying to produce an asset that someone wants and someone wants to pay a lot for it. So, if I'm looking at the northern beaches, for instance, or even in a west or eastern suburbs, I'm not going to be putting Laminex bench tops and $2 PC
Yep.
items into the property. I'm going to be
Mm.
spending premium money to provide a
Mm.
premium quality asset. So
Yep.
it's just like anything in business. Again, my approach to treating properties like a business is important because I want to provide something to somebody that they're willing to pay more than what the real value is. So
Excellent.
that to me is important.
No, excellent points there. We really appreciate you tuning in to the Property Buyer Podcast, and I hope that you're finding our expert interviews helpful. So that we can keep providing this information and growing our audience, we rely on word of mouth recommendations. If you found this information useful, could I please ask you to share this podcast with your friends, family and colleagues and ask them to subscribe to the Property Buyer Podcast. It would be a big help and we'd be very grateful for your support. Thanks once again for sharing the links. And now let's get back to the podcast. Now, I guess on a similar vein to sort of talking about where to invest, what are the best types of properties that you like to invest in? You talk about, picking the right area. How do you decide what type of, like thinking back to perhaps even your earlier stages in your property buying career, what sort of properties did you decide to buy in? Were they apartments? Were they houses, townhouses? What's going to work for someone who's building it up?
So earlier on, it was a mix of houses and townhouses, Rich. And I found that as, again, I evolved, I wanted more X factor. I wanted to get my fingers. I wanted to use my brain as much as I could to create and generate value. I just didn't want to have my property sitting there for a longer period of time waiting for the market to do its thing. So for me, moving forward, buying the townhouses and then selling them later on, I focused on properties where there just was a little bit of X factor, and it could have been just as little as a renovation or a granny flat to something a lot larger where it could have been a duplex site or a subdividable block of land. So for me, having that little bit of sugar on top that can sweeten the deal and change the numbers in your favor, that's what I aim for now. And I encourage clients wherever possible, after you've built up a couple of properties that are very foundational in nature, that are the pillar of your whole portfolio that you can lean back onto for equity, then you can start to move into smaller X factor properties. And again, it could be as little as a renovation or adding a fourth bedroom or changing the layout of a home to add value, to a granny flat or to something much larger. So for me, what type of properties am I investing in is things that I can add value. And even to this day, I'm not afraid to buy a property where it could be just a small renovation for hopefully an ideally good markup in terms of a value from an equity position or a resale position.
Excellent. Really love that approach, Jeremy. That's great. What's been maybe one of the best investments you've ever made? What sort of returns did you get from that sort of investment?
So there's probably been a couple that stand out. Buying in greenfield areas. I did some research into greenfield areas, and it's not something that I typically invest into a lot. But knowing this particular area quite well and knowing the pipeline of infrastructure works that were coming in, I decided to buy a block of land, and all up the overall cost was about 900 grand to build the duplex in the land. And then 2 years later, sold the whole thing for nearly $2 million, Rich. So that's one that did really well, more than doubled my money in the space of 2 years. And
was that also a market timing thing? Do you think you were lucky, or you think you just bought really well at the time?
Absolutely market timing. Absolutely lucky. Absolutely lucky. The market did very well, but I was able to pull the trigger at that right time. When I started seeing, 100 people turning up to an open home, to me, that's just a huge amount of insanity in terms of the price. And that's the type of market that I want to be selling in. And for me, it was the opportunity then to move that money and to push it into 2 deals. Now, those 2 deals didn't do as good as the first one on its own, but those 2 deals combined produced the same results as one. So you're not going to have every single deal making a stupid amount of money. If you get it, it's brilliant, but you've got to have your parameters of your min and max. And once your property hits a maximum threshold that you're happy to take, sometimes it's worth pulling the trigger. That greed gets involved, and that property did drop, believe it or not, did drop during the Banking Royal Commission, and that property would have came back about 30% in its entirety before coming back up to its peak and maybe surpassing it. So if I held on to it today, I probably would have gained a couple $100,000 additional profit. But I look at the 5 years that I would have had to wait to gain back that couple $100,000. For me, I've done so much more with that money in the interim.
Got it. Yeah, fantastic. Wow, some great tips there so far. You mentioned earlier you've got 23 properties. Do you mind me asking what's the sort of total value of your portfolio, if you're happy to share? And secondly, how did you manage to finance so many of these properties over time?
So financing, it's always been a tricky thing for me. So as my income's grown in my profession, that has helped. The right structuring has helped me quite a bit as well. A lot of the properties that I'm holding, I've held for some period of time, and I've been able to, buy property, add value, and sell half of it or sell the rear property. And that's been given me an opportunity then to pay down debt, extract equity, and then move forward in a different structure. So for me, a lot of my properties are held in 8 different trusts. So that's been brilliant. I've got a mixture of commercial and residential as well, just to help with the cash flow, because some of my residential properties at any stage might be losing some money, and that's then filtered in and factored in by the commercial properties that are making me money. So I'm utilizing properties to kind of pigeon pair and offset each other. So at any one point in time, I'm not having to take money out of my back pocket and move forward with more properties in mind, better properties in mind. And I'm not afraid to pull the trigger and sell. In the last maybe 3 years, Rich, I've probably sold now close to 15 properties and bought back 10. So for me, I'm always happy to pivot. I'm always happy to sell, realize my profit, unfortunately pay the capital gain tax, which I hate paying, but then utilize that money to buy a much bigger asset. So the denominator for me is one of the most important things in my portfolio. I want to grow that denominator as large as I possibly can in a very sustainable way, because that means that very small percentage movements result in very large gross gains.
Mm. Do you
So
do you have a target in mind, or where you want to get to, your denominator?
yeah, so the goal for me is that initially when I set out, I said I wanted $10 million worth of property, and then I
Mm.
pushed that to $20 million worth of property, and then now it currently sits. My goal is $30 million worth of property, so
Mm.
not far away. But
Mm.
for me now, I'd love to say, well, let's push it to $50 million worth of property.
Mm.
But it's not going to come from buying your standard, homes on a 600 square meter block of land now. For me, I need to look at much larger things. So I'm building my denominator by going back into some of the initial properties that I land banked very early on and putting units on. So at the moment, I'm doing the construction for 10 units in WA.
Mm-hmm.
And when that's completed, I'll be doing 10 units in the Campbelltown Basin. So
Mm.
that's going to be my goal now. I'm not necessarily going to have to buy
Mm.
more properties to do it. I'm just going to have to build on my portfolio and create more properties.
Fantastic. I'm just going to unpack a few things there, because you just gave some fantastic advice in the last 2 minutes that I want my listeners to really understand. So, when I asked you, how did you finance so many properties? So firstly, you said your income increased. So that's one tip I say to people: keep improving your skills, keep improving what value you have as a person, because you can't just always close the door on the boss and go property investing. You need a regular income in order to be able to service your properties. Secondly, you said holding your property. Some people are too quick to pull the trigger. But thirdly, you also said you trade some, and that's great. You're recycling your equity into a bigger and better opportunity. And I think that's a key thing there, is that if you look at what you've got in your portfolio and you go, you know what, I can refinance this property, pay down a bit of debt here, but I know I'm going to get a much greater return by buying this other property here that's got development potential, for example, then doing that. You also said you got a mix of resi and commercial, and that really helps you to cash flow your whole portfolio. And I think maybe that's another question for you. We see a lot of investors get stuck on just buying one investment property. How can the average investor achieve multiple properties over time? How can they get that cash flow to sustain buying multiple properties, do you think?
Yeah, so you've got to look outside the box. You've got to think at the real value of your property and what the market wants. So is it really good short-term rental property? Potentially it might be really good long-term rental property. What is the market willing to pay for? And then you provide that to the market. And the other thing I'm seeing quite regularly now, and I adopt this in my own portfolio, is the use of the right structure, Rich.
Mm.
If you can get the properties into the right structure, there are some banks which do favour the way that some investment properties act with inside certain structures like trusts. And long term, if you can get these particular assets into a position where they are be able, to be serviced on their own 2 feet from the rental income that it generates, some banks will look at it quite favourably to negate the debt and then continue to move on forward. So there are significant advantages understanding the finance spectrum, and that's where it's probably been my key takeaway. I've learned so much about the finance space and how to finance property, looking at very successful investors all around the world. The art is not sometimes necessarily just buying the property.
Mm.
It's learning how to finance the deal.
Yep.
And any developer will tell you out there that 90% of their pain point is not building nor selling, it's
Mm.
financing.
Mm.
So if you can understand that model very early on and how to work with the biggest stakeholder that you'll ever work with in your life, being the banks, then that's an important process to learn, identify, and then execute so you can adopt that in your own portfolio.
Yeah, fantastic. Really good advice. And just again on that, how does the average buyer get going? What are some of the tricks that you've learnt that you could share with our audience in getting finance for property investing? I mean, is it just a matter of paying off your credit card every month? Is it just a matter of having a clean record? Are there any other kind of key tricks that you'd say that help people to get finance and get into the market?
Yeah, so planning accordingly of your windows of opportunity becomes very important. If you know that you've got a window of opportunity, your income is absolutely fantastic because you've worked 3 jobs consecutively for the last year, then you've got to make the best possible outcome that you can with inside that time frame. Because sometimes it's not sustainable, especially anybody in business, Rich. If you've had an absolute cracking year in your business, that is the time where you've got a really great window of opportunity to be able to go forth and buy more properties, knowing full well that you might have a slowdown to come in the years ahead of you, or it could be some significant investment that you need to make in your own business. So like to work with my clients and say, what have you got planned for the next 1 or 2 years with your money or with your job? with your family. Family becomes very important. One of the biggest inhabitants that I see people unfortunately lose on is when they're planning for families but not really speaking to their broker about it.
Yeah.
You know, if you're planning to have a family in the next couple of years and you've got this brilliant income between you and your partner, that's sometimes the best time to go hard if you can budget accordingly, of course. Because once a family comes and your partner has to take time off work, that does diminish your borrowing capacity. So being very aware about your borrowing capacity and what the world looks like for you in 2 years ahead is important, because that's where you start your planning, you execute on your plans, and then you might go through a bit of a consolidation phase. Circumstances change after that, and then you open up your window of buying opportunity again.
Yeah, excellent point. I think borrowing capacity is super important. I always say to people, your borrowing capacity is like gold. It's the goose that lays the golden egg every year, and treat that accordingly. And you've got to use it or lose it, as you've said. If you're in a small business or you're a business owner, as you say, some years will be better than others. And if you've got capacity, go to your broker, get a pre-approval, and start investing. And I think a lot of people, I guess, are put off by the amount of paperwork you've got to do, the number of documents you've got to pull together, and that's just part of the pain process. You've got to do it, but often then they'll get the approval and then go, oh, obviously searching for properties is so hard, and they put it off. They don't think about using a buyer's agent to kind of help them progress the process. So I think it's really important to, as you say, plan ahead for people planning kids, or one of the partners maybe not working. Yeah, plan that into the long-term plan. I want to ask you a question, which is often a tricky one. You remember Paul Clitheroe, the old financial planner, used to sort of recommend paying off your home before you start investing, was kind of his method. But lots of homeowners these days have got stacks of equity in their home, but they're afraid to use it. What's your view on, paying down the home loan first before investing, and what would you advise?
Look, if you've got an abundance of money and nothing to do with it, then no one ever went broke paying down debt. But once you really understand what money is and how economies and RBAs or reserve banks and governments value money, you see that it's just a piece of paper, and it gets withered away, its buying power, with inflation every year. So I learned very early on that, and it was a lesson my father told me. He said, Jeremy, if you have $200,000 debt today and you only pay interest for the next 10 years, what will that debt be in 10 years? And I'm there with a calculator trying to do all these really sophisticated calculations. And I looked up at him and I said, Dad, the debt would be only 200 grand. He said, that's correct. He said, but what would that property's value, what would that rent be in 10 years' time? And then again, I'm trying to do all these sophisticated calculations. And I said, probably double. He said, that's the lesson you need to learn. He said that if you can use yesterday's money and invest that in tomorrow's assets, you multiply that by obviously a significant amount of time, you learn very quickly that money, the value, gets withered away every year through inflation. And there's no joke, there's no hidden secret. It's not a joke out there. The RBA tells you that every almost 19 to 20 years, they want the whole economy to double. Because if their target is 3%, 2 to 3% inflation, if you add that up, compounding 3% each year, roughly, I think by memory, and you're an economist, Rich, you'll know this as well, I think it's about 19 to 20 years, or maybe slightly more, 21 years.
Yeah,
but every
correct.
21 years, the RBA is wanting the economy to double. So if your money is in the market for at least 21 years, we expect it to double, but your debt won't. Your debt won't. So if you can get as much debt as you can hold comfortably, budgeted for, and have that in the market for at least minimum 21 years, we expect it to double. And once I kind of got an understanding of how money and how fractional lending works and the mechanisms behind it, I learned very quickly that having my money paying down debt and not being invested in assets, once that debt's paid off, your property is moving in the market, but you already had that property already. So what will my value and what will my money look like in 10 years if my debt stays exactly the same? So for me, I know and understand now how money works and what governments around the world are wanting money to do. And that's every year have less ability to continue to purchase more goods. And that therefore brings inflation.
Yeah, I mean, I'll do it on another podcast, but I've actually analysed some stats the other day, looking back over the past 25 years, and the average growth rate, I should say, for Sydney and Melbourne has been roughly 7.5% per annum over the last 25 years. And if you take Sydney's median house price of, say, approximately $1.5 million, In 25 years' time, Jeremy, guess what the median house price will be in Sydney?
Yeah, no idea,
It'll
Rich.
it'll be $7.9 million.
There we go.
So that's just mathematics for you. Simple as that. And people are going, what the hell? In 20 years' time, it'll be about 5.5 million. But even jumping from 20 to 25 years ago, it's from 5.5 to 7.9. It's just dramatic. The rate of compound growth. I mean, Albert Einstein said it was one of the seventh wonders of the world. And that's the thing about being in the market. And the longer people put off building a portfolio, the more behind the money they're going to be. So I've got another one for you. Putting your accountant's hat on. What if you had $1 million in equity today? What would you do with it in today's market? And let's assume you don't have a big portfolio. I just want you to go back to being a sort of a more beginner investor here for our audience. What would you do with that money, do you think?
So $1 million today, if I had it in today's market right
Mm.
now, I'll be a little bit against the grain on this to many,
Mm-hmm.
property enthusiasts and property advocates out there, but I actually feel the best market to be in if you can afford the negative cash flow, very important as a disclaimer, the negative cash flow would be the Victorian market. A lot of my understanding at the moment is when I'm looking through a number of properties is it's very near its pre-COVID value. It just didn't have the bull run that a lot of the other states
Mm.
did during the COVID
Mm.
pandemic because they
Yep,
actually had a negative population growth.
exactly.
And it is changing. I've just heard on the radio the other day that 316,000 migrants came into the country, settling between Victoria and New South Wales.
Yeah.
And now Victoria's population is starting to show positive growth
Mm.
numbers and figures, which means
Mm.
that there's going to be a little bit more stretch and a little bit more
Yep.
pressure being put onto
Yeah.
the Victorian housing market. So for me, if
Mm.
you can afford the negative cash flow, the big
Mm.
disclaimer,
Yep.
I think for me right now, $1 million would be very suited in the Victorian market, especially in those inner rings around the city.
So, Jeremy, we didn't talk before we had this podcast, and you have amazing ASP, but I would 100% give you a gold star for that comment because I was actually just talking to a group of bankers earlier today, and they were asking me, I showed them all of the stats for the last 12 months and which markets have grown. And, Perth's done 18%, and Sydney's done 10.5%, Brisbane's done 12.5, etc. And I was saying, then Melbourne has done a little measly 4%. And I'm saying, have a look at this opportunity right here. So picking the future winners doesn't mean picking the highest percentage growth in the previous years. It actually, exactly as you said, there's a thing called a reversion to mean. And there's also key drivers in different markets. And I totally agree with you that I think Melbourne is an underrated capital city for capital growth, but it's not getting the yield. And that's the issue you've got for a lot of investors. And yes, the Victorian government's imposed a slightly higher land tax. I mean, it's marginal. It's not the end of the world. But if you can afford the negative gearing, I do think agree 100%. Melbourne is great for longer term capital growth. I've got another question for you. As an accountant, what are some of the sort of best tax tips that you could share with us that they could implement in their in building a portfolio? Is there any kind of key tax things that we need to watch in building a portfolio?
Yeah, so it changes from time to time. So depending which market you're in and interest rates at the time and how your property portfolio is performing, I like to tailor people's situations quite differently. But a couple of the key things that I'm working with at the moment with many clients is while cash flow is a little bit of a struggle at the moment with these higher than COVID rates, I always believe the rate at the moment, while it is high, it's not the highest I've seen as
Mm,
an investor. My first property I purchased, there was an 8 in front of my interest rate, and that was cheap
mm,
at the time. But at the moment, the rates are high, much higher compared to what we've seen in the last couple of years. So PYG variations are very prevalent at the moment, and
mm,
that's giving people the opportunity, again, the value of money today. It's giving
mm,
people an opportunity rather than waiting at the end of the year to receive a refund. They're
mm,
getting that refund through a reduced amount of tax that their employer has to withhold. So PYG variation is a great way to get your tax refund throughout the year as opposed to the end, giving you greater cash flow to be able to hold your property during the tougher times.
mm,
Timing of expenses is very important as well, Rich. A lot of people will wait until July and August to do some of those repairs, and that means you're waiting another full year to receive the level of tax benefit. So if you know
mm,
that there's some expenses in your property portfolio from a repairs and maintenance perspective that you need to do now, do it before 30 June.
mm,
Time versus value of money, getting that refund back as soon as you can from the money you spent is important.
mm,
A couple other things, if you've got opportunity in your property portfolio where you can improve the position, don't wait. A lot of people, I can do a granny flat on this property, I'll do it in 10 years. I've seen many clients with great granny flat properties who have waited 10 years to build one. And if they built one at day dot, they would have spent 70 grand on a 2-bedroom granny flat, returning at that stage 250 a week.
Yeah.
Today, that same granny flat would cost you 200,000 and it's returning 500 a week.
Exactly.
So for me, again, it comes back to inflation of cost. We know things are always going to get expensive. So, and your rent will probably be the same for a 5-year-old granny flat as a new granny flat, typically. So if you've got an opportunity to improve the cash flow position of your portfolio, don't wait. Because during the GFC, one of the biggest things that I saw was land bankers go bust because they all waited for this golden opportunity to bring, their land to the market. And when interest rates went up during the GFC and lending became strictly much tighter, much stricter, these people went bust. But if they did the development at the time that they acquired the land, say in the early 2000s, they probably would have made their money and walked out with a significant amount of cash. So if you've got an opportunity to do something, you do it straight away.
Yep.
Probably not a tax tip, but more so a cash flow tip. The other thing is diversifying into the right structure. Lots of clients, they look at a property's position today where it might be negatively geared, but they're not treating the property with a business plan attached to it. So again, if you've got a great business plan attached to your property, you know that in 2 or 3 years' time, you can get this very positively geared. Think about what that property's position would be in for the next 15 years, not the first 3. Because if you can have that property in the right structure, there are substantial ways to minimize tax long-term, not just looking at the short-term benefit today. The last thing I'll mention is understanding your superannuation. So many clients I have to educate on what super actually really is. How does it work and the things you can do with it. People just leave their super to the side and it really becomes active when they're about mid-50s. I think sometimes that's too late to nurture your super. It's got to start at an early time because one of the best ways to get the best bang for buck in terms of tax minimization is additional superannuation contributions if you've got the capacity to do it. The government's got some great incentives, such as the 5-year carried forward superannuation concessional rule, which is a great way to top up your super. And again, with the ability at a certain level of money that you've got to leverage and buy property in a self-managed super fund, that's a great way long-term that you can turbocharge your portfolio utilizing your super in a substantially better tax environment, 10% tax rate on properties or assets being held longer than 12 months with a 1/3 discount, 15% tax rate on earnings, and up to about $1.8 million of superannuation tax-free income at retirement. So you can eat your cake and eat it too. You can have the candle burning at both ends, which is only going to benefit you moving forward. So they're probably the biggest tax tips or things from an accountant that I would recommend.
No, fantastic. I guess part of this topic is around how to build a portfolio. And I guess the key question here is how many properties or what value of properties does someone need to retire? How would you answer that question, Jeremy?
Look, everything will be adjusted for inflation and people think, but if I try to work towards 100 grand today, 100 grand in 20 years is not going to help me. Inflation will bring that number up. But that number has changed, and every time I read more publications, it seems like it's getting larger. But I would probably say, when you're near retirement, I think 100 grand in today's money is probably more than enough to retire quite comfortably, depending on your expenses, of course, which would be meaning you need about a $2.5 million portfolio returning about 5% in gross income to achieve that. And that takes into account expenses, 20% shading. And inflation will help bring that number up. People tend to forget, Rich, that when we get older and having older grandparents now, we don't need a lot of sustenance. We don't need a lot to enjoy our life. We can't, my grandfather recently passed away, God bless his soul. But I remember when I first bought a sports car, it was a Mustang at that stage many years ago. He was in his early 80s then, and the poor bugger couldn't get in and out of the car. So the chances are you don't need a Ferrari in your retirement because your walker won't fit in the front seat. So I think it's understanding what retirement looks like for you is quite important. And that
what if you get a Tesla?
What
if you get a Tesla truck with a special lift for the wheelchair, mate? Then you can.
Definitely, mate. With the cost of electricity these days, I don't know if people can afford to fill those things up with the electricity. But I think that's important. Knowing what your retirement will look like or want it to look like is important. Start the way you want to finish and have that end in mind, and you'll find that your number that you need is not as much as you think.
Okay.
A lot of people set their goals too high, mate. They're on a 150 grand income and they want to retire on $400,000 a year. You're not spending that much money under today's circumstances, so the chances are you won't need that. But it's good to strive for it. It's definitely good to strive for it, but it may be just a little bit out of your reach.
Got it. And is there an age where, I guess, property investing stops making sense? Like for people in their 50s and 60s, is it sort of make sense for them to think about building a portfolio, or have they left it too late?
No one's left it too late. There's never an age to stop investing in property or investing in whatever you wish to. But it comes back down to what you want from your investments. Typically speaking, and very openly, I see a lot of people pivot away from property in their later stages of life, mostly residential, to cash in on their capital growth. And they're done with the headaches, they're done with having to fix kitchens. And then they pivot maybe into a little bit more of a cash flow investment, which has got low maintenance. So your goal is between now and retirement, you've got to get as much growth as you can, because while you're still working, you probably don't need passive income as much because your job is helping you, put the food on the table. But once that golden goose is gone, which is your job where you've got this recurring cash flow, then you've got to pick and choose the right assets that are performing. So I'll give you a great example, Rich. I've just got a client who we worked with over the last couple of years. He had a $30 million unencumbered property portfolio, no debt. 30 million. The net income that he was receiving from this portfolio was about 250,000 a year.
Why so low?
Land tax. The New South Wales state government was making more money from his property portfolio than he was. A lot of his properties were in that $5 million bracket, worth $5 million, but the rent was only $1,500 a week. Bringing these back onto a net yield. The net yield on some of these properties were only around about 1% to 2%. Now he's happy with his growth. He doesn't need his balance sheet to be any bigger. What he's after now is a much stronger P&L. So with a couple of great financial strategists, we worked with selling down his portfolio, only about $10 million worth. Paid the capital gain tax, which was in just above $1.5 million at that time. And we moved his $8.5 million net balance into various different other assets, very high cash flow assets. And his P&L today looks closer to about $700,000 a year, as opposed to about $250,000. So the pivot needs to happen. Simply holding properties for your entire life will get you maybe where you want to be, but you need to always analyze your investment on valuation basis, not just cost basis. Because some of these properties that he had on yield on cost was 20%. Which is brilliant, but yield on value, in some circumstances, it would have been better for him just to sell the property and put the money in the bank. Again, but that's at a different time where he's not really worried or factoring in the balance sheet movements. He wants a P&L position now.
Got it. Fantastic. Well, it all points to getting professional advice around at their various stages of your life. Don't try and do it alone, I think is a key message here. And Jeremy, you've given us some wonderful advice here. Can I just pick your brain one last time and ask you to share perhaps the best piece of investment advice that you've ever heard?
Money goes down, properties go up. That's the best investment advice I ever heard. Money goes down in value and properties go up. I don't think that's a blanket call for every property, of course, but I think it just goes to show that, if you're having lots of cash being saved up, or, like the Italians out there who store it in the backyard in many of the holes that they've dug or under the pillows or mattresses, your buying power of that money reduces year on year. So having it in assets at least gives you the opportunity to move with inflation, and having it in great assets gives it the opportunity to far exceed inflation. So in an environment that we're in at the moment, which is inflation is the buzzword, Rich, money goes down in value and assets go up.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Look, Jeremy Iannuzzelli, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. If people want to get in touch with you, they can get you at KHI Partners. Is that correct?
That's it, khipartners.com.au. Hit the contact page and I'm sure we'll get back to you very soon.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you again so much for sharing such great advice. And I just want to really encourage our listeners that have heard the message today that building a portfolio takes effort, It takes skill. There's lots of different parts to it, but don't be afraid of setting out on that journey to build it. You can do it. And many people have trod the path and been successful, had some war stories along the way, but definitely build a team around you. And if we can help you at Property Buyer in picking the right assets, picking the right locations, and particularly the right kind of properties, we'd certainly love to be part of that journey with you. So please reach out to our website, propertybuyer.com.au, and we'd love to chat with you. Jeremy, thank you once again. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you, Rich. Pleasure to chat with you today, mate.
So please stay tuned for another edition of the Property Buyer Podcast. We'll be back in touch with you again in another 2 weeks' time. Bye for now. Thanks for being with us on another Property Buyer Podcast. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the SpeakPipe link and we'll answer this during the next episode. If you're looking to buy a residential or commercial property in the near future and would like to get the added advantage of having a buyer's advocate on your side, then please reach out to my team today and send us your inquiry, and we'd be delighted to help. Please visit our website at propertybuyer.com.au, where you can stay updated with all my latest market updates, weekly blogs, and live suburb profiles to help you make better property decisions. We look forward to connecting with you again on the next Property Buyer Podcast.